Good morning, everybody. This is a live extreme weather briefing on the tropics. Getting things set up really quick here. Stand by. Thank you for joining me for this live extreme weather update. We got a lot to talk about today. Let me get this other stuff fired up. Good morning, Southeast Texas. Good morning, JJ. Never stop chasing. Good morning, everybody. This is a live extreme weather briefing as we have a lot to talk about, especially the tropics. We have a new tropical wave that's off the coastline of West Africa. There you can see the National Hurricane Center that does expect this storm to develop over the next 5 days as it lifts off to the west-northwest across the subtropical Atlantic. There you can see that tropical wave just off the coastline of West Africa. A couple little convective bursts out there across the open Atlantic. Does this mean that the tropics are heating up? Is this an arrival of peak heating? That's what we're going to discuss during this live weather briefing. Basically, the tropics depend on many factors. There's a lot that the meteorologists look at when coming up with a seasonal forecast of hurricanes in a tropical basin such as the Atlantic or the Pacific. In the Atlantic, some of those important factors are ENSO, El Nino, Southern Oscillation, with a La Nina raging across the tropical Pacific. That usually means a more active hurricane season across the tropical Atlantic. You get overall a reduction in the wind shear across the basin. You have an intensification of the easterly trade winds across the tropical Atlantic, a weakening of the easterly trades across, the Pacific, a weakening of the trades across the tropical Atlantic, and overall a reduction of the wind shear that these tropical waves experience as they move off the coastline of Africa. Another factor are sea surface temperature anomalies, and if these ocean temperatures are warm across the tropical Atlantic, the Caribbean, and the Gulf of Mexico, we're going to discuss the sea surface temperature element of all of this as well. And another factor that's included in the seasonal, especially the sub-seasonal forecasts, are the Madden Julian oscillation cycles, basically MJO, Madden Julian oscillation. Those are Kelvin waves that will propagate around the globe, basically associated with westerly wind bursts or a reduction of the easterly trade winds and an uptick in convection. You get these convective blobs that will form across certain ocean basins or even continents, across belts, across the tropics and the subtropics. And that blob of increased convection will basically propagate around the tropical belt of the globe, and as it arrives upon that can lead to an uptick in tropical cyclones that can happen across the Atlantic. So we're going to discuss the sea surface temperature element. That includes the Gulf of Mexico, which is relatively warm. We're also going to discuss the impact of We are also going to discuss the impact of the tropical Atlantic sea surface temperatures, the La Nina cycles as well. We are going to discuss the Madden Julian oscillation. Here is an example of the Madden Julian oscillation. Basically, that's an uptick in convection that propagates around the tropics and the subtropical globe. And when that arrives across the tropical Atlantic, that usually means that you're going to see an uptick in convection when that arrives. I'm going to show you exactly the phase of the Madden Julian oscillation as well. And we're going to look at the forecast models for that disturbance that is the tropical wave that is just off West Africa. This is a great tool that you can use to track the Madden Julian oscillation. Basically, the red there is June, and then the green is July, and then early August, you're starting to see that blue color. And basically, you could track the uptick in convection that's associated with the Madden Julian oscillation using this tool. You can plot it, and when that uptick in convection arrives off West Africa and in the Western Hemisphere, basically zone 1 and 8 there, that means that you're going to have an enhancement in convection across the tropical Atlantic, and it looks like it happened here across late July. However, we didn't see an uptick in tropical cyclones out over the open Atlantic. Might have just been a little bit too early in the seasonal cycle. And as this comes back around, looks like it's going to be timed for late August into early September once again. Right now it's out over the Indian Ocean. We're starting to see an enhancement in the convection. That's where you're getting an enhancement in the convection over the Indian Ocean. Next, it's going to be over Southeastern Asia. Then it moves out over the Western Pacific, and that's when you're going to see a ramp up in the number of typhoons out there across the very warm waters of the tropical Western Pacific. And as that burst of convection then moves west of the dateline, or east of the dateline, out over the Western Hemisphere and out over the Atlantic, that's when you start to get an uptick in the convection across the Atlantic basin, and it looks like that's going to be happening toward the end of August. So we're out in early August right now with that enhanced convection over the Indian Ocean. Then you're going to see it propagate out over the Western Pacific. It looks like a lot of that MJO was relatively suppressed across the Western Pacific, and then eventually moves out across that to the east of the dateline into the Western Hemisphere, eventually out over the tropical Atlantic, and it does look like that's going to be happening again toward the end of the period. This is another great way to analyze and track the MJO, and basically these orange colors, that shows the presence of enhanced convection during certain parts of the globe. You can see time on the left, basically going from early in the year, February, March 2022 toward August 2022. Time is on the left. Here is the date line in the middle. So you're talking about the Pacific Ocean areas. Out here, you're talking about the Atlantic. Out here, Western Hemisphere versus Eastern Hemisphere. And the blue coloring is suppressed convection, and the orange shows enhanced convection and anomalous outgoing long-wave radiation. When you have storms that extend high up into the atmosphere, those are also transporting heat from the low levels to the top of the atmosphere. The tropical cyclones play a huge role in the transport of heat from the equatorial belts up to the poles. So here you can see one of those convective bursts propagating around the globe toward late July. It actually passes over the Atlantic, eventually arriving toward the Atlantic belt, passing the dateline. And you start to see a new uptick in convection over the Indian Ocean, and that is just the beginning of the MJO as it is cycled all the way around the globe. Eventually it's going to pass over the Pacific during middle August, Western Pacific probably here in the next week or two, and then it's going to pass over the dateline toward the middle of August, and then eventually should arrive in the tropical Atlantic toward the end of August. These are westerly wind anomalies, so when you see the bright coloration, that shows a westerly wind burst, and a lot of times you can also track these convective bursts around the subtropical and the tropical belts using these westerly wind bursts. Of course, we've had a La Nina that's been dominating the Pacific Ocean. That's why we've had anomalously strong easterly trade winds at the low levels across the tropical Pacific and over the tropical Atlantic. You have anomalously westerly winds. That's why you have a lot of those reds. And that's also why La Nina typically favors a more active hurricane season for the Atlantic basin. That's because you have a stronger Walker circulation across the Pacific. You have these overall, on average, you have stronger trade winds, easterly trade winds across the Pacific Ocean. You have weaker easterly trade winds, anomalous westerlies at the low levels, basically at 850 is a good way to visualize these. But within El Nino and La Nina, which can last 1, 2, even 3 years, I think we're on at the 3rd year of La Nina, you get this sub-seasonal variation as well. So you can see these little streaks that go from the upper left of the diagram down to the lower right. That's as this MJO or convective burst is propagating from west to east along the tropical belt of the Atlantic. And right now you're getting a little bit of a westerly surge of the trade winds across the equatorial belt. That's also associated with a convective burst across the Indian Ocean. Looking at our Madden Julian oscillation chart, that's where you could see that convective burst is located right now over the Indian Ocean area 2, 3, zone 2 and 3 of this chart. There you can see the blue line starting to propagate. That's early August, and that's going to continue going around in a circle, and then eventually it's going to arrive back out over the western hemisphere. Usually these are about 60 to 90 day cycles as they go around the globe, so it looks like about late August into early September you're going to have an enhancement in the convection out there as well. And as I mentioned, the other factors that we look at are sea surface temperatures around the globe, but also La Nina. And here is your La Nina across the tropical Pacific. You do have a little bit of warming in the eastern tropical Pacific. Could that be that this is finally starting to change sign? Maybe we're starting to see the emergence of El Nino conditions. I think in 2023, we're going to see the emergence of an El Nino, more of an energized subtropical jet, more split flow patterns. But we also have this dominating warm blob, the North Pacific Oscillation across the Northern Pacific. We have a lot of warm water across the Northern Atlantic. We do have this emergence of some negative anomalies, a little bit of a cool water across the subtropical Atlantic. That would be a limiting factor overall for the Atlantic hurricane season. That's why some of the seasonal forecasts for the Atlantic basin have come down just a little bit, including the recently released Colorado State forecast, still predicting an active season for the basin overall. But some of this cooler water that's starting to migrate into the subtropics could be a relatively limiting factor for the hurricane season. But overall, you have this still very mature La Nina across the tropical Pacific Ocean. That overall should lead to a more active Atlantic hurricane season, at least across the Atlantic basin. It will suppress, however, the tropical cyclone season in the Pacific, but we do have these little warm anomalies that are starting to ooze into the eastern tropical Pacific. You can also see the negative PDO horseshoe that has a extratropical branch. You also have the subtropical branch of the PDO. That is starting to warm up a little bit and moderate. So you're starting to see some warm water begin to appear across the PDO horseshoe, but still the dominating factor is this warm blob across the north central Pacific. That has led to a ridge that is focusing further west across the Pacific, leading to more of a semi-permanent trough across Western Canada, Western North America, spring into summer. That's why we've had a very legendary hail season too across Alberta. Mark has been really active up there with the Skyballs project, measuring hailstones. You've seen a lot of those videos of motorists out across Canada getting their windows blown out. It's been a very active season for hail across the Western Canada prairies, and I think that's largely attributed to this warm NPO, the warm blob across the north central Pacific. Western Pacific, you do have a little bit of warm water, not cooking like it has over recent years. You have to wonder if that's going to suppress the tropical cyclone season out there a little bit. And out over the Indian Ocean, that's where your convective blob is located right now, and that's just going to continue to march off to the east with the MJO. Once it hits the Western Pacific over the next week or two, probably going to see an uptick in typhoons out there across the Western Pacific. It's then going to hit the La Nina here, where you have just really strong easterly trade winds at the low levels. And you also have weaker trade winds then across the Atlantic basin due to La Nina, weaker wind shear as well basin-wide that allows those tropical cyclones to thrive. Tropical cyclones thrive off of an environment with reduced wind shear. But overall, you do have that emergence of these cool anomalies into the subtropical Atlantic. Could be a limiting factor for those Cape Verde storms that come off West Africa. And it does look like this tropical wave, many of the latest models are showing this to dissipate over the graveyard here over the subtropical Atlantic. I'm going to break that down next. But you can see overall the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean still relatively warm, not cooking like they have been in years past, but still plenty warm to support a relatively active hurricane season. These are the latest raw sea surface temperatures, not anomalies, but raw. And anything that is the green and warmer, the green yellows, that's going to be plenty greater than 28 degrees Celsius. Really, if you're greater than about 27, 28 degrees C, then tropical cyclones will be allowed to thrive. You have a little bit of upwelling here off the northern Yucatan, probably due to the rivers flowing into that area. One thing that stands out, very warm water off western Florida and also off Houston area, southeastern Texas, and off the coastline of Louisiana. A little bit of a moderating factor, though, that's happened across the north central Gulf Coast. A lot of rainfall, a lot of cloud cover has held those sea surface temperatures in check. But associated with the loop current here in the eastern Gulf of Mexico, very warm sea surface temperatures. So if we do get any storms that are able to form in the Caribbean and then slide up northward into the eastern Gulf of Mexico, there's a lot of oceanic heat content across the eastern Gulf and also the northwestern Gulf of Mexico. And those are raw sea surface temperatures, not anomalies as much. I also have the anomalies plotted out. Let me show you this track as well. And this shows Gulf of Mexico sea surface temperatures versus annual hurricanes in the Gulf. And I want to show you this plot. This thing is striking. Thank you, everybody, for joining me. I know it's been a while since I've done a live update. I was out there chasing monsoon, intercepted many front walls of the flash floods out there. Thinking about going back out, actually, once again. There we go. Got it pulling up here. Possibly next week. And there is a flash flood watch today across Phoenix. I was going to be covering the monsoon next, but first I want to show you this plot. And basically the red shows you years and months when the Gulf of Mexico is quite warm. The blue shows it when the Gulf of Mexico sea surface temperature is below normal. And the green plots on the bottom, that shows you where shows you the number of hurricanes. And I want to go below really quick so I can annotate this image. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in to this live weather report. There we go. So, of course, you can see these active years. This shows you a period of incredible Gulf of Mexico warmth, starting in about 2013-14, leading up to 2017. And you may remember this 2005 season was incredibly active for the Gulf of Mexico. We had Hurricane Katrina out there. We had Hurricane Rita. And then there was a period of relative inactivity all the way until 2017. This is the period right there. We did have some Gulf storms, tropical cyclones that were in the Gulf of Mexico. But after about 2005, there was about an 11-year drought where there were no U.S. landfalls of hurricanes that made landfall, and especially after about 2011. Look at that, hardly any storms in the Gulf of Mexico. But toward the end of that period, you could start to see the Gulf of Mexico really ramp up in temperature. And then 2017 came around, and that's when you had Hurricane Harvey. You had all those storms in the Gulf of Mexico. That began a very legendary season in the Gulf of Mexico, and a legendary period for that matter that started in 2017 until about the present. And then we had this very record-breaking, unprecedented period in the Gulf of Mexico in 2020 where there were a number of storms in the Gulf. That was the pandemic year. We had Hurricane Laura, Hurricane Delta, Hurricane Zeta. 2021, we had Hurricane Ida in the Gulf. And look at that. Not surprisingly, Gulf of Mexico sea surface temperatures were quite warm leading up to 2020 with all those hurricanes. They were also very warm leading up to 2017, but there were a number of years, 2015, 2016, 2014, where the Gulf of Mexico was very warm, but we just didn't have storms that were in the Gulf of Mexico to take advantage of that warmth. You can see here, relatively quiet in the Gulf of Mexico, not as many hurricanes to take advantage of that extreme oceanic heat content until you hit 2017. And then once you hit 2017, it was like the bottom fell out. You had a major dissipation of that oceanic heat content. You had to transport a ton of heat up to the poles, and the Gulf of Mexico just cut loose with a very record-breaking season. 2018 and 19 in the Gulf of Mexico, not as active as years past during that, even though we did have Category 5 Hurricane Michael during 2018. Gizmo rode out that hurricane in Panama City Beach, so that made you think that, oh, the Gulf of Mexico was also active in 2018. 2019, not very active either, but we had Hurricane Dorian that moved through the Bahamas, threatened the east coast of Florida before turning off to the north, hit locations like Marsh Harbor across the Bahamas, very dangerous storm. And then we had 2020 after that with a number of landfalls along the Gulf of Mexico that included Louisiana, Mississippi, portions of the Central Gulf. You can see here toward the end of the time series, we're back warm again. And usually after the warm falls that will happen, you'll get a wintertime period with below normal temperatures across the Gulf of Mexico. And that's because you get so many tropical cyclones and hurricanes in the Gulf. It leads to overturning of the Gulf of Mexico. You bring those colder temperatures up to the surface through a process called upwelling. And that's why a lot of times the extreme warmth, once you get a number of tropical cyclones in the Gulf of Mexico, you'll then drop back below normal during the winter months, and then it charges back up. I think a lot of this warmth as you're leading up to hurricane season is also related to a westward extension of the subtropical high into the Gulf of Mexico, and that leads to relatively cloud-free skies, a lot of heating of the oceanic surface, and that causes the above normal anomalies to develop across the Gulf of Mexico. And then you get a number of tropical cyclones, and that leads to this period of relatively cool temperatures. And then it'll ramp back up, and that's exactly what happened leading up to 2020. You had very warm temperatures in the Gulf of Mexico, and then it cut loose with a number of tropical cyclones that helped to overturn that body of water. It does look like we're starting to increase those temperatures once again, probably related to a westward extension of the Bermuda High, and I'm going to show you that right now, and then also relate that to the forecast for this tropical wave that just came off of Florida. So I think that these warm sea surface temperatures, especially in the eastern Gulf of Mexico, are due to a westward extension of the subtropical high over the southeastern U.S. I've heard a lot of my friends from Florida say, oh, we're just not getting as much daily thunderstorm activity down here. The sea breezes aren't lighting up as much. And I believe that's because of this gentle subsidence with a westward extension of the Bermuda High. And you could definitely see that Bermuda High extending all the way into the southeastern U.S. and across portions of the Gulf of Mexico. A little bit west of that western lobe into the north central portion of the Gulf of Mexico, there's been a greater number of storms, greater cloud cover. That's why you're a little bit closer to normal now off the coastline of Louisiana. But I also think that this westward extension of the subtropical high allows these tropical waves to take a more further south track. It also allows for storms to fire down into the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico and slide up into those warmer temperatures. So I think that there is a subtle linkage that's happening, a little intermodulation between the westward extension of this Bermuda High, the sunshine out here, the positive sea surface temperature anomalies over the Gulf of Mexico, and also for further south track for these storms. So this is the forecast for Tuesday morning. These are the GFS ensemble members, and you can certainly see a cluster of those low pressure centers just off the coastline of West Africa. That is our tropical wave that the National Hurricane Center is showing potential for development over this zone over the next 5 days. You may remember looking at the sea surface temperature anomalies that there are some negative anomalies across the subtropical belt just to the north of that system. Still relatively warm, though, across the tropical Atlantic. But we step forward with time and watch how the upper levels change, and especially the position of the Bermuda High. So there it is, and then boom, look at that thing consolidate further east. Your high pressure consolidates east. You have a trough off the east coast. And you still have this cluster of low pressure. This is by late week Thursday, Friday. You're probably going to have a tropical cyclone out here, whether it be a tropical storm, might even be a hurricane, still well to the east of the Lesser Antilles. But a majority of the models are taking this up on the western periphery of the Bermuda High. This trough comes in, weakens the blocking high off to the west, and you get a weakening of that anticyclone, and that should cause this system to turn off into the subtropical Atlantic and potentially weaken as well. We go out to next weekend, and a majority of those model members do weaken that system to the north of the Lesser Antilles. A couple members do show a weaker tropical cyclone that might threaten the northern Antilles, but a majority of them weaken that system here in the graveyard across the subtropical Atlantic. If this were a more robust system, if you didn't have the negative anomalies, and if it were later in the seasonal cycle, closer to Labor Day into September, I think that you'd probably have this curving off to the north. But it's also not a very favorable period for the MJO. I think you just have some gentle subsidence across the Atlantic basin that remains. I do think that's going to change toward the end of August, though, as that gentle lift, the uptick in convection propagates back around and across the Atlantic. It looks like late August into early September, and that's going to be timed toward peak season, traditional peak season for tropical cyclones across the Atlantic, and that's why I think that you're likely going to see an uptick in the tropical cyclones out there. But this wave just off West Africa, I don't think it's a sign of the arrival of peak season just yet. The favorable phase of the MJO is still out over the Indian Ocean. It's still got to go over the Western Pacific, eventually come over to the Atlantic. And I still think that if this high has a tendency to extend west over the Gulf of Mexico, you're going to continue to increase those sea surface temperatures, increase the overall oceanic heat content of the basin, and you could be setting the stage for a potential active hurricane season out there. We're also seeing this cluster of low pressure centers across the Caribbean Sea toward the end of the period, toward next weekend or toward the middle of August. It's very possible that we could get some development out of this Central American gyre over here, whether it be on the side of the Pacific, over the eastern tropical Pacific, or over the Atlantic. Still, time will tell on that one. So it does look like this disturbance is going to develop. The National Hurricane Center does have greater potential for development here over the next 5 days across that zone. Beyond that, though, I do think that this tropical cyclone is likely going to dissipate. A lot of the global models are starting to show that long term. So those factors that we look at when we're looking at just how active the season is going to be for the tropics. On a subseasonal time scale, we look at the Madden Julian oscillation to try to pick those time periods within the active season on when hurricanes are going to ramp up. Looks like that's going to be late August into early September. Right now, the more favorable phase of the Madden Julian oscillation is over the Indian Ocean, about to move out over the Western Pacific. And once that slides over the Atlantic toward the end of August into early September, that also could be relatively active. The other factors we look at, El Nino, La Nina cycles. We still have the La Nina out in the tropical Pacific. We're starting to see a little bit of a dissipation, though, in the eastern tropical Pacific with the arrival of maybe a sign of a shift toward El Nino. Very rare do you get 3 years of raging La Nina like this right in a row, back to back. I do think it is likely to shift over to an El Nino pattern. Usually that happens during late summer into the fall. So it should be happening right about now. And we are starting to see a reduction in the upwelling in the eastern portion of the basin. See if I can draw on that. And usually when the trade winds will start to weaken, you get a little less upwelling of those cold temperatures from the depths of the ocean just off of Peru. And whenever those trade winds start to weaken, that's when you start to get a warming of those surface anomalies. I think this is largely related to a westerly wind burst when the MJO passed over this region during late July. And that helped to contribute to the warmer temperatures. developing, but overall it does still seem like a very healthy La Nina. You can see these oceanic Kelvin waves, even little wave-like features, wave breaking that's happening. But a very healthy La Nina usually means stronger easterly trade winds across the Pacific Basin, but overall a more favorable wind shear environment with reduced wind shear across the Atlantic Basin that should favor the development of tropical cyclones. But looking at the raw sea surface temperatures, we do have this belt of relatively gentle negative anomalies. That'll be a slight limiting factor for development. But just off the coastline of Africa, we have slightly above normal sea surface temperatures that should facilitate the organization of that tropical wave into a tropical cyclone. Eventually, it could die out, though, over the relatively cool waters, especially this early in the season out there. But the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico are still slightly above average, and we saw that in the time series kind of ramping up. It does suggest that there's going to be an active Caribbean and Gulf season, at least in terms of the oceanic heat content, also in terms of the La Nina across the Pacific, and in terms of the MJO, the uptick of convection that right now is out over the Indian Ocean. That is going to propagate across maritime continent zones, across the Western Pacific, eventually across the dateline, and then could lead to an uptick in the convection, tropical waves, and hurricanes across the entire Atlantic Basin, Gulf of Mexico, Caribbean, and tropical Atlantic toward the end of August and the first half of September. A lot of hand waving, though, comes into play there with the seasonal forecast of hurricanes. I did want to talk about the moderate risk for flash flooding that is in place across southern Wisconsin. This is Freeport, Illinois. Here is the Illinois-Wisconsin border. We basically have some stratiform rain, some heavier rain that's moving into this area. Overall, the MCV has already dumped very heavy rain across this zone. You can see the lead portion of the MCV moving over southern Lake Michigan. I don't think that this is going to be a mega flood event, but there are going to be these isolated flash flood warnings. That's greater than about 5 inches of rain across the Freeport, Illinois area. That yellow blob, there's Freeport off to the southeast. That is going to contribute to some flooding, probably some river flooding and flash flooding. Basically, that yellow zone there shows rainfall at 5 to 6 inches. Out here in the Corn Belt, big time rivers, Mississippi River out here across western Illinois. This area can handle a ton of rainfall. It takes multiple days of rain, usually double-digit type rainfall to generate a mega flood up here. We saw the recent flood down in the St. Louis area, 10 to 12 inches of rain led to a mega flood down across that area. This is the zone that we're watching, southern Wisconsin, northern Illinois. Usually with these large-scale MCSs, though, a lot of times the flooding ends up happening a little bit further south than the forecast models will show. A lot of times the heaviest rain will have a tendency to want to propagate toward the greater instability. Here's the composite reflectivity showing you that heaviest rain right now south of Chicago, moving into southwest lower Michigan. Kind of some stratiform rain continuing to add problems here, but we only have one flash flood warning across that area right now. I am probably going to be doing these live in-depth briefings for my Facebook page for subscribers only soon, and then I'm going to sling a briefing like this probably once a week or so to everybody on Facebook and YouTube. But my Facebook subscribers have been there since the beginning, and I figure that these in-depth briefings are not as desired by a larger audience. So I figured that they're a more niche audience, so I'm probably going to be doing these for Facebook subscribers. I'll be posting a link shortly, but then I'm going to plan on doing these every day and kind of morph my Storm Chase EDU platform into my live briefings and make them more of an educational experience, more of a personal experience, so I could keep up with a chat as well on there, answer questions about meteorology, cover the basics of meteorology and the forecasting process. I try to do more of a top-down approach to the forecast process, a process that I've honed over the last 20 years of storm chasing. I like to start off with the upper pattern, recognize shapes of the upper level troughs, compare those to real observations to see how good of a handle the models have, and then I like to drill down into the finer details. This time of year, you're more forecasting southwest US monsoon, ridge rider, flash flood events from the central US and across the central and southern Appalachians. There's your moderate risk for flash flooding across northeastern Iowa, southern Wisconsin, and northern Illinois. That's during the day today. But also notice the slight risks in the desert southwest and along the Colorado Front Range. Flash flood watches are in effect across the Front Range. That also includes the burn scar zones, the Cal Wood Fire burn scar, Cameron Peak Fire burn scar up across northern Colorado could flow again. And a look at the slight risk across Arizona. This is just day one of that renewed moisture surge across the desert southwest. And it looks like this entire week is going to be active across the southwest U.S. So that's what I'm going to be targeting next. I'm thinking about heading back out to the desert southwest and intercepting those front walls of the flash floods. Something I'm deeply passionate about. Learning that passion largely from the flash flood guru, David Rankin. Let's look at the forecast for Monday. Starting at 300. Trying to predict where this high pressure area is going to consolidate across the west. In general, you can see this southerly flow off the eastern tropical Pacific that pumps moisture northward from the Sea of Cortez and across the southwestern U.S. That's, of course, what we're seeing with this pattern. That's going to lead to the moisture surge across the deep south today. Looking at the winds, it does look like that high pressure is centered over the Four Corners by Monday, bringing those southerly winds up through western Arizona, southern Nevada, and up through Utah. And let's see how that upper level pattern persists with time. Obviously, you get this dominant high pressure zone centered near the Four Corners, and look at this belt of southerlies exacerbated by this trough just off California. So a trough moves in and you have even a little bit of a squeeze play over the desert southwest. That's going to bring that moisture northward off the Sea of Cortez. That's Tuesday. This is on Thursday. The high lifts a little bit to the northeast into the central plains. Still, though, getting this southerly flow over the desert southwest. Definitely exacerbated by that trough that approaches the western U.S. A little bit of a squeeze play happening. There's the moisture surge into the desert southwest. Look at those 60s dew points lifting up. It might miss a lot of north central Arizona and the Utah Grand Staircase. I wonder if that moisture is largely going to be a little bit further west on this one. Las Vegas has had some moisture and flash flooding during this summer. Some of those have even been threatening some of the casinos. Just seeing that debris flow going through the basement of those big time casinos. Everybody trying to place their sports bets. Today, the moisture doesn't quite make it up to Vegas. It does make it up into Houston, all the way up to the rim. South of Flagstaff, a majority of the flash flood watches are to the south of Flagstaff, down near Phoenix as well, even southeastern California. And to watch that moisture surge expand during the day on Monday. Expanding into Las Vegas. Death Valley is probably going to get more flash flooding from this, but you can certainly see that moisture surge all fueled by the high over the Four Corners region. So you get that high pressure. Wind, of course, is counterclockwise around the high, so that the southerly winds on the backside of that high are pumping moisture northward off the Sea of Cortez and the tropical eastern Pacific into the desert southwest. That's Monday afternoon. Tuesday afternoon, quite a bit of moisture still in place. Let's compare it with the NAM model. NAM has much higher dew points into Flagstaff as well by Tuesday afternoon and Monday. But a lot of those dew points, look at that over Southern California, just coming right in off the Sea of Cortez into Southern California by Monday. Those dew points. Quite high dew points into southeastern California and into southern Nevada up near Las Vegas. So that's going to be the play, it looks like, during the week ahead. and you're going to have moisture every single day coming up. It's just whether I want to fly to Las Vegas or Phoenix, work Southern California area off the Sea of Cortez or not, but does look like a pretty active, energized monsoon pattern that's going to be coming up ahead. So thank you everybody for tuning in to this morning weather briefing. We covered everything, the basic building blocks of a tropical forecast, of a tropical outlook. We look at La Nina, El Nino cycles that dominate the largest body of water in the Pacific Ocean and how that impacts the wind shear conditions over the different basins, with a La Nina raging in the tropical Pacific that leads to a reduction in the wind shear over the Atlantic basin. We also looked at the raw sea surface temperature anomalies from an oceanic heat content perspective. Just because the Gulf of Mexico is warm doesn't mean it's going to be an active season in the Gulf. You still need those tropical disturbances, those tropical cyclones to move into that body of water to take advantage of that heat content. We do have a little bit of some negative anomalies working their way into the subtropical Atlantic. That would be a little bit of a mitigating factor. We also looked at the subseasonal forecasting techniques, the Madden Julian oscillation, looking at an uptick in outgoing long-wave radiation as a way to track those blobs of convection as they propagate around the globe with a 60 to 90-day periodicity cycle. Right now, the uptick in convection is over the Indian Ocean. That's going to be moving over the Western Pacific in the next week or so, and eventually arriving across the Western Hemisphere and across the Atlantic Basin toward the end of August, maybe into the early portion of September. So I'm thinking I got to get out into the desert Southwest for this last couple of weeks of monsoon season, really before the tropics heat up. So that is my game plan coming up here. So thank you everybody for tuning in to this weather report. I really appreciate everybody that tunes in to these more in-depth analyses. I'm going to continue with these. I'm going to do these briefings for everybody, especially when the weather is substantial and when the weather warrants it. But I am going to be doing these in-depth briefings more exclusively for my Facebook subscribers coming up here soon. So thank you, Facebook subscribers, for riding along in my passenger seat over these last 3 years. I am going to be getting back into regular updates, live Q&As, and live weather briefings coming up. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. Never stop chasing.